Here at T-Rex, we talk about personal responsibility quite a bit, and generally we are talking about the responsibility to defend yourself. But you have other responsibilities as well that I think you should maintain and not just hand off to other people. Welcome back to another T-Rex Talk. Last week we talked about open source stuff quite a bit. We launched a bunch of new open source product, if you will. It's all stuff that we're giving away for free, but it's the plans for products. So I kind of still think of it that way. And the reception from the community has been really good. And a number of people have actually jumped in, which has been super fun to see. I want to give a special shout out to Sigint Intelligence and Great Plains Creation. They sent me 3D scans of radios, which I added to the larger 3D scan library of guns. And all of those files are hosted on GrabCAD at the moment. And so you can go and you can get those there. And they've had thousands of downloads already, which is very gratifying. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of freedom of information, but also whose responsibility it is to make information free, to actually do the work of doing that. We talked about this just a hair in the last episode. We talked about the fact that the open source community is not entirely, but largely made up of people that have fairly socialistic ideas, that all information should be free. It isn't really a free speech thing. It isn't really a free market thing. It is just a total, complete socialistic freedom thing. Somehow collective society is going to pay for whatever cost exists, and everybody's kind of going to do their thing, which I push back against, even though there's elements where that is or should be the case. We shouldn't be utterly dependent on large corporations to do specific types of work for us. We shouldn't be utterly dependent on the large federal state to do things for us and to make sure that everybody is sharing their fair share. We should be doing a lot of this stuff ourselves, but voluntarily and not because a bunch of socialists have decided that that is the way forwards. And I hope that a perfect example of this is kind of what T-Rex is doing with our free open source files. We're not saying that everybody who's involved in the holster making community needs to share all of their proprietary work files. And we're not actually doing that either. What we're saying is we did a bunch of work to build these 3D scans of all of these different guns that is menial, tiring work that we really don't want anyone else to have to do. We would prefer that our competitors not reinvent that wheel, not redo all of that menial taxing work that anybody can do if they have the guns and they have the scanner. We would like to free them up to do other innovative stuff that will be better for the community and better for the economy and better for our customers and for their customers and the industry as a whole. So not communism, but free market capitalism, let's say. And I want to thank GrabCAD, where we are hosting all of our 3D files, for hosting many 3D files. There are large libraries of things that are up there, not just 3D scans, but also full-on mechanical assemblies of things that can be dragged into Fusion 360 or other CAD packages for people who want to build and develop stuff. Now, here is the tricky part. I don't believe that GrabCAD charges us for our data being up there, but I do know that it costs them something to store all of that data. We have like 6 gigabytes of files up there at the moment. There have been tens of thousands of downloads of those files, so that is a lot of bandwidth and hard drive, and the interface for looking at the files on their website is quite good. That couldn't have been developed for free, so they have a significant cost in serving the files that we are making available. Now, fortunately, GrabCAD seems to have a fairly comprehensive business plan where they offer services to people, and that is how all of these different services that you get for free are paid for. You are not the product necessarily. They're not getting your sensitive data and selling it to other people. They actually get a commission from various types of 3D printing and 3D scanning and 3D fabrication services get used. They connect makers with fabricators and take a cut. And I think they do some other stuff as well. So they are a very good source of information, and they provide a very useful service to people like us who want to share our 3D files. But there is an idea that I want to get into with this particular conversation that we are having. The freedom of information that we enjoy is going to require that somebody store that information. And again, we're not implying that every piece of information that you possess should be free. You should be able to control what information you own is free. And you should be able to operate inside of a free market economy that is free enough that you see the value in sharing the information that's going to be beneficial to the people around you. If you have a gigantic federal government that does all of the management of that stuff and takes a huge amount of your taxes, it's going to be much harder for you to do that. There is a risk at T-Rex Arms that by releasing all of these 3D scans of all of these guns, our competition is going to get the jump on us. They're going to be able to skip all of that boring work of running the 3D scanner and scanning all of those hundreds of different guns and put that into making better holsters than we can make, or making more holsters than we can make, and surpassing us as a company. That is a risk that we will have to take, but it would be a much smaller risk if we were paying less in taxes. If our margins were fatter, those kind of risks would be really, really easy to take. And if our margins were thinner, those kind of risks would be much, much harder to justify. But as it is, and we described in the last video, we think that the benefit to the community as a whole is going to vastly outweigh any sort of holster sales that we lose. And by open sourcing the other files, it's going to be good. The rising tide will lift all of the ships. And I believe that in free markets, in free economies, the free transfer of information is going to have that sort of beneficial, cumulative, wealth-generating effect. There won't be the same kind of negatives that exist inside of a less free economy, where hoarding information and keeping people in the dark is actually preferable to keeping the gears of the large socialistic state moving. Which is why I am simultaneously excited that we live in the information age, and there's just a huge amount of information that is available on the internet right now. When I was a kid, learning about guns meant going to the library, and you were just very limited in what you could get in your actual local library. It had finite space, and you could search for books in other libraries and have them transferred to you with a significantly long wait. But it's so much faster now to learn about specific things. Yes, my library had copies of all kinds of novels and the usual things that every other library had, but very specific books about computer animation or about firearms that I was interested in when I was a kid, those were just hard to come by. And now, thanks to YouTube and a bunch of other websites, that stuff is really, really easy to find. However, it's easy to fall into this false sense of security that says that YouTube will always be providing me with the information that I need. Google will always help me search for the information that I need. The files will always be available on GrabCAD or wherever, and let our guard down. I was recently going through a whole bunch of old hard drives of past projects. We're talking about hard drives that are 10 to 15 years old, and about half of them started up. And the interesting thing is these hard drives had a bunch of data on them that we did not put in the cloud. 15 years ago, the internet wasn't really fast enough for us to want to put hundreds of gigabytes of video in the cloud, and so we didn't. And any data that was on those hard drives is now gone, sort of. A lot of it's video files. We still have the tapes. We could probably digitize them. If we found an old enough recorder, it would, yeah, possibly. The good news is none of that data is drastically valuable. None of it's mission critical. All of it is stuff that I wish we had, but it's probably not worth the cost of recovering the data from those failed hard drives. But it is really easy to fall into this false sense of security that because everything on the internet seems to last forever, it's just always going to last forever. Barbara Streisand's address, that's going to last forever on the internet. Embarrassing pictures of yourself that you uploaded to social media back when it was MySpace, that may last forever. But files that you actually want to find, if you're the only one that's looking for them, probably won't last forever on the internet. In fact, the internet that I remember from when I was very young barely exists now. Websites like AngelFire and GeoCities that were just chock full of data because people were building their own websites and maintaining them on these different web hosts kind of went away. They were replaced by large social media platforms like Google and Facebook, and people started to do less of the maintaining their own website thing. Now, the problem is they were maintaining their own website, but they were doing it on a server that was controlled by other people. So all of those websites, all of that information, all of that data is kind of gone. Some of it has been backed up other places. Some of it has been backed up by archive.org on their Wayback Machine. Some of it was migrated by the people that actually ran the sites, but some of it is actually gone. And that might be a little bit hard for you to picture. It's kind of hard for me to imagine chunks of the internet just disappearing and vanishing because it feels like stuff lasts so long and just will always be there. But when you think about it, the internet itself is so incredibly young, and a lot of these file services that we use, like the Microsoft OneDrive or the Google Drive or the various other drives, those things are so new that expecting them to last forever is incredibly naive. And I think it's going to be a lot like a lot of other services. We assume that the large state is going to take care of us at all times because it kind of has in the past. I think that's a faulty assumption. There is a responsibility that we have to take care of and maintain information that we want to stick around and not just assume that other people are going to do it for us. Now, I'll be the first to admit that not every bit of information that is being lost is going to be missed. It's not incredibly valuable stuff. Not every GeoCities site, not every Angelfire site really needed to be recorded forever. Even my little websites that I used to run back in the day with the demo reels for my animation services. Yeah, good riddance maybe. But there's a bunch of data that's being lost that may be useful. Some of it is only going to save you a little bit of work. Let's say that all of the T-Rex 3D scans got lost. Well, the practical guns themselves still exist. 3D scanners presumably will exist in the future. All of that work that we did could be redone. All of that data could be recreated, and nothing of great value would be lost if that stuff were gone. But all of those hours spent generating that data would be saved if the files were saved. That's why I'm really encouraged to see a lot of people downloading all of those different documents. So if something terrible happens to GrabCAD and none of that data is there, at the same time that I lose my hard drives over there and my offsite backups at home and other places, guys out there in the community, you listening to this podcast perhaps, have already downloaded the files and you have those out there. So when somebody on a future social media platform or forum or whatever the internet 3.0, 4.0 social interaction looks like, if somebody asks for 3D scans of a P320 such and such, you may have our actual data, even though our files are gone, our hard drives are gone, GrabCAD is gone, whatever. If we can decentralize the memory of this information and the storage of this information, it's going to be a lot more resilient, just like if we decentralize other stuff. That's why we upload a bunch of stuff to different places. That's why the T-Rex YouTube channel is backed up on Rumble and on Odyssey, just so that there is a little bit of redundancy. But we're also saving that stuff locally because I don't necessarily assume that these very large, benevolent, entirely selfless companies like Google are going to continue to be entirely benevolent and selfless or profitable in the future. The second point that I want to talk about is the importance of some of that information. Information that is lost can sometimes be regained. Information that has been generated through the learning of lessons, for example, well, people will inevitably need to learn those lessons again, and then they can write their conclusions down. And the more costly the lessons are, the more costly it is to learn them again. That's why the saying, those who will not learn history are doomed to repeat it. This is because the lessons that you learn from going through the very difficult times of history are lessons that you will need to learn again if you don't learn from the mistakes of the past. And if they are important lessons, learned through significant trials and bloodshed, maintaining the lessons and the information that we learned when we learned those lessons, that's going to be super valuable in the future. And in many ways, I feel like we're kind of at peak information age right now. There's tons of information that is out there and it is relatively freely accessible. We've seen censorship happening on different platforms in different places, more in some parts of the world than in others, but we've only seen the edges of it. We haven't really seen full-on censorship yet. And we've started to see AI start to generate data, and AI-generated data is often not trustworthy because the AIs are hallucinating. They don't actually have full understanding. But we haven't seen massive amounts of completely untrustworthy AI data yet. Right now, I feel like we're in a sweet spot where we can see a lot of past data still, and the data that we have on the internet is largely intact and somewhat trustworthy. Now is the time when I think more of us should be librarians, collecting and taking advantage of what it is that we have. But in addition to information loss, and completely untrustworthy information generation, we have kind of a third threat, and that is postmodernism. Now, I realize that postmodernism is not new. This idea that there is no absolute truth, everything is completely subjective, you can define your own truth and speak your own truth and so forth, has been with us for some time. It's been destructive for some time. But when you combine that with artificial intelligence is generating however much information you want on whatever subject you want with whatever filters you want, and a loss of old information, I think you're just getting yourself into a significant hole. And we're already starting to see that with certain topics. So during July 4th, when we celebrated the independence of the United States, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, I saw lots of conversations on the internet about that particular time in history. And a lot of that conversation was really good. But we've kind of missed a lot of historical stuff from that era that's made it a little bit hard to figure out exactly what the founders had in mind when they did certain things. And there are certain people who are remembered as having a much bigger effect on that particular time in history than they probably deserve. A great example of this is Thomas Paine. Now, Thomas Paine, a tremendous pamphleteer. He's just a phenomenal writer and summarizer. But the ideas that Thomas Paine is pushing in the 1770s are really not his ideas. And you can tell that this is true because after the War for American Independence, he goes over to France and participates in the French Revolution, and he writes about a totally new set of ideas. He is great at summarizing other people's ideas and being kind of the froth on top of the wave. He's a super good writer, he's super memorable, and it's very easy to say, this is the guy. This was the driving force of that particular American Revolution, even though he showed up like partway in from England and just basically came up with really good slogans for all the things that people in America had been talking about for decades or centuries. And then he went over to France and he did exactly the same thing with their Jacobin guys, and it's a totally different set of ideas, but he is really good at summarizing them. And then Thomas Paine is it's a whole long story, but he is not like one of the fathers of the American story of independence. He is kind of like the Bill Nye. Bill Nye is not a scientist, but he's a fantastic communicator. And so when Bill Nye gets really good scientific principles for his TV show back in the 90s, he's really good at explaining those and turning those into interesting children's television. But when Bill Nye is instead getting all of his ideas from modern, woke, politically correct, postmodern child educators, his show is a lot less scientific. Guys like Neil deGrasse Tyson are the same way, or Carl Sagan, people who are super excited about the science that is going on, the developments in space exploration, but they're not the guys who are actually doing the work. They are the pamphleteers, they are the explainers, they're the people who are getting people really interested in this stuff. And that's a super useful job. In fact, I'm really sympathetic to those guys because they can see the work that's happening over here, they can see how it might be important, and they're really good at getting people on board. Those are not the guys that should be remembered as the fathers of a specific movement. Bill Nye is not the father of American scientific thought. He's a TV comedian with a engineering degree who made a science show with PBS's money. And Thomas Paine, kind of the same way. So how do we know this to be true, though? How do we actually know whether or not Thomas Paine is this incredibly important political thinker with the sheer brain power to move nations over the course of, a few years, but have ramifications for centuries? Well, we would go back and we would look at the source documents. If you can find the source documents, you can see all of the writings of all the founding fathers and their correspondence, their letters to other people, the speeches that they gave, and then you would have a really good idea of what people were talking about prior to Thomas Paine showing up. You could read the sermons of the preachers who the founding fathers were listening to every Sunday as they went to church. You could figure some of this stuff out. Once you have the source documents, you can actually figure out what the truth is. Now, the source documents are a little hard to find. And it isn't just because GeoCities is gone and Angelfire is gone. And it isn't even because there's a gigantic conspiracy to try to squash that stuff and make it go away completely. It is just people save the information that they think is interesting. Carl Sagan and Bill Nye are way more interesting than the guys who are doing the actual work and publishing the actual PhD theses and actually doing the mathematics and the super boring calculations. And so it is really easy to save the Bill Nye TV show on whatever streaming platform it is than it is to save all of the source work that went into it. Well, actually, the new Bill Nye show doesn't have any particular source material, but You get the idea. And remember, I'm not saying that there's not a conspiracy to get rid of inconvenient facts. I'm just saying that it is really easy for us to be interested in the fun stuff and ignore the big stuff. And then depend upon the large institutions out there, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Microsofts, to store all that important, boring stuff while we watch the Bill Nye Show on whatever streaming platform it's on for, as long as it's on there. Actually, this is a major problem. There is so little physical media in the entertainment space anymore that you see things like movies and TV shows being completely inaccessible. And it's not always the old stuff, because there are still DVDs and VHS tapes and Betamax tapes floating around there that still actually work, believe it or not. In some ways, DVDs and CDs are some of the best archival media that we have. And the streaming services, we assume, will be magical and last forever and work forever. But there are movies that came out this year that were available only on Disney Plus and are already gone. There's a science fiction movie called Crater, and I know nothing about it because it was available on that platform for 48 days and only 48 days. And there's no plan for it to come back, and there's no plan for it to go anywhere else because the deal that the producers of that film made with Disney don't really allow for it to go anywhere else. So put yourself, just for a moment, in the shoes of that particular writer, director, and the producing team. They made a movie so that people could see it, not just so that they could sell it to Disney. And now, because they sold it to Disney, almost nobody saw it. And theoretically, people might see it again in the future, but they also might not. And when you don't have the source documents, when you don't actually have a way to double check things, you fall into a couple of traps. The first trap is you fall into the trap of postmodernism, where you don't know that that is true, that thing that I just told you. You can't go look up Crater to see if it actually exists. But you also fall into another issue where you can make accusations about stuff, and there's no way for the person to absolve themselves because the proof doesn't exist. And again, I'm not implying that there is a terrible conspiracy. I'm not implying that that movie has messages in it that could be seen to be pro-Trump. And that's why it's no longer on Disney Plus. We could never know. But I think that it is really important that we have enough of the source documents that we can discern what the truth actually is. There is an idea that exists out there in the ether that in the United States, we have three branches of government, the executive, the judicial, and the legislative, because of a guy named Montesquieu. And because Montesquieu is French, we assume that he got this idea from Thomas Paine, and he is just another one of these really important Enlightenment, humanistic, atheistic thinkers that invented this really cool idea completely out of scratch, and the Founding Fathers jumped on board. But there's another idea out there that says that the three branches of government is something that Christians had been talking about for centuries because you actually can see it. In fact, not only can you see it throughout all of Scripture, but you can actually see it in a single Bible verse in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah 3:22 says that God is our lawgiver, our judge, and our king. Three very specific offices that just happen to line up with those three branches of American government. So which is the actual source? Well, if you have the actual Federalist Papers, you can see that Montesquieu actually is quoted by, I believe, James Madison. James Madison talks about this book that Montesquieu has written, and he talks about this idea. But he doesn't talk about the idea as if Montesquieu is the originator. He talks about this idea and mentions that Montesquieu is in support. And he mentions Montesquieu's research that is in the book. Very influential book, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Montesquieu is the source. But if you don't have any prior source documents, you don't have any way of checking this. And if you don't have the Federalist Papers, you can't even check that. You can just check however many lines down into the Wikipedia page tells you that Montesquieu came up with the idea, and you see it in the Federalist Papers 51 or whatever. You have to have those source documents so you can actually figure out what is true. And so you can actually figure out what lessons from the past are really important to imply now. This separation of powers is a really important idea, something that's been kicked around for a very long time. And I think Montesquieu knew that it had been kicked around for a very long time because even though he was living in Catholic France, he specifically was married to a Protestant Reformed wife, and he was writing specifically about the way that England was doing its separation of powers. And if you read Samuel Rutherford's Lex Rex, and if you read Blackstone's commentaries, you can see that English lawmakers and thinkers were talking about separations of powers because of Isaiah, not just because they were waiting for Montesquieu to have the idea off the top of his head. If you have those documents, you can learn the lessons. And then you can figure out what other lessons need to be learned. The separation of powers is so deeply ingrained into American thought right now that I don't know that we're in incredible danger of losing that. But if we lose the value of it, then it'll kind of go away. But what other things are we on the verge of losing, and how important are they? I actually don't know, but it's something that all of us should take a little bit of time. This can be the homework assignment, thinking about. And some of it's going to be deeply important stuff, like Samuel Rutherford's book, Lex Rex. Super important book, probably far more important than Montesquieu's book. Very widely read and has a very, very important concept. Lex Rex, the law is king. It's very, very foundational document for a whole bunch of people who thought about stuff, not just the Christians. Side note, the T-Rex in the T-Rex Arms logo has a name. His name is Lex, not a coincidence. But kind of the point that I'm making here is that we need to actually do the work of retaining these documents. We can't just expect that large storage companies that are our ideological enemies are going to keep our ammunition for us. This is something that we need to do a little bit more of ourselves. And I think it's worth keeping even less important information, like those 3D gun scans. They may not be the foundation of a free nation and the future of Western civilization the way that Lex Rex and Blackstone's commentaries and various other works from the 1600s were, but they are hundreds of hours of work that people could save themselves if they had those files in the future. And one of the ways that you need to work on having some of these files in the future is actually doing the work. I want to figure out how better to archive some digital material. It's actually frustrating to me how bad hard drives are at lasting for a long time. And even the new solid state SSD drives, theoretically they're going to last for a long time, but they are so new that we're actually not sure. DVDs, CDs, printed film, microfilm, and books actually hold up really, really well compared to digital mediums. And so I want to inspire you guys to visit more old bookstores, find more old books, and keep them. These are books that are probably not going to show up on Google Books. They're not getting turned into Kindle books. There are a bunch of really weird, fascinating military publishing houses that existed in the 60s and the 70s. They wrote very esoteric military stuff that is not important when you talk to modern academics, and there's probably not a ton of interest in it on the Amazon Kindle market, and yet it's worth keeping. It is work that somebody did. It is research, it is first-hand commentary of battles and military equipment that is worth saving, because the lessons that were learned are lessons that you don't want to go out and learn again. Even the Soldier of Fortune magazine, which is interesting, and it's a great compilation of FUD lore and probably a bunch of really over-the-top stuff, that is information that should not be lost. Is it going to be as important as Lex Rex, Vindicia Contra Tyrannus, some of the other founding documents of Western civilization in America? No, but it's work that we don't want to have to do again. It's historical information that provides a tremendous amount of context to a tremendous amount of world conflicts and political issues, and even firearm engineering things. So I talked on Instagram a little while ago about the need to develop a digital copy of Soldier of Fortune, just so that we can be sure that multiple people have multiple copies of as many episodes of that magazine as we can get our hands on. Not so that we can, pirate it, but so that we can make sure that it isn't lost to time. Soldier of Fortune magazine. Not one of the great linchpins of future freedom, but probably a pretty good project for figuring out how we want to do this digital library project, where we decentralize the storage of information, even if it's not, groundbreakingly important, even though it's not maybe mission critical. It's data that should not be lost. It's data that we can figure out how to capture. A bunch of us listening to this podcast probably have issues of that magazine in our attics or in our parents' garages, and we could scrape them up. So there's a very interesting collection of PDF files of Soldier of Fortune magazine on archive.org, which I will link to, and I would like some of you to download it. Not because we're trying to rip off Bob Brown, who's still alive, by the way, and a friend of my dad's, strangely enough. And not because we're trying to somehow steal value from the current owner of Soldier of Fortune magazine, but so that we are just preserving these documents and 3D scans of guns and maybe Gutenberg the Gutenberg Project is tons of scanned books, almost all of them public domain, some of them from way, way back when. Some of them include those very important founding Puritan documents that the founders of America were reading. If we help store some of these documents and help preserve some of these documents and, actually, read some of these documents, I think that would be a really good homework assignment from now until, the rest of your life. So in addition to cultivating the open source project and adding more scans of radios and weapons and other things that is very important to have tangible physical knowledge of, we're going to try to figure out how best to store things like field manuals and other publications, and just try to capture some of the data, some of the information, some of the wisdom of the past that is not likely to be saved by the data-saving magnets of today. And I think we should recognize that the data-saving magnets of today are not infallible. There's a very large online cloud storage solution called InfluxDB, and they wiped out a whole section of their European server farms. And anybody who was storing data on those particular servers lost it. And they kind of told people ahead of time they were going to do that, but they did it in a way that most people didn't even notice. So that left a lot of people pretty high and dry. Louis Rossmann is a guy who talks a lot about technology, and one of his phrases is, the cloud is just somebody else's computer. So when you store stuff in the cloud, you're just storing it on somebody else's computer. We should take some personal responsibility to save the things that are worth saving and not just expect that somebody else is going to do it for us. The preservation of life and liberty, not just the physical protection of self, home, and community, but also the information, the tools, the skills, etc. Life and liberty require that you preserve a lot of stuff, and we need to take more personal responsibility to do that.